These interviews are in partnership with BTCC Blueprints. Go check them out, they sell all sorts of brilliant merchandise from t-shirts to posters and much more. You can visit their website using the link in the description below. Welcome Bradley Philpot, racing driver. Obviously you made your British touring car debut last season. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you, Louis?
I'm good. Thank you for coming on.
Not a problem. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
No worries. So where and how did you start racing? Where did it begin?
Well, it was a long time ago now, so I have to really think about it. But I started racing at an indoor kart track that no longer exists in Fareham, which I believe was called Fareham Indoor Karting. It was in a big warehouse amongst a lot of lorries. And it was quite a small, very slippery, old school indoor kart track. And that's where I first turned a wheel in competition.
And I presume it was in sort of hire karting.
Yes, it would have been in probably a 100cc 4-stroke, very, very slow rental kart that didn't have any bumpers. Like, they just had metal front bumper, no plastic pods, and that would have been in about 1995.
Really? Would you say that's the best way to start? Just doing some rental karting and seeing if you enjoy it. I guess that's the big thing.
I'm probably a little bit biased because I run the British Rental Kart Championship, and I'm quite an advocate for inexpensive motorsport. Getting into karting without having to commit hundreds of thousands of pounds initially. So I would say yes, probably it is a good way to start because it's a really good way to at least dip your toe in without having spent lots of money. If you don't like it, then that's it. You've spent maybe 30 or 40 pounds. Had a little session and you can go home. Starting to buy your own equipment and do the more expensive way is obviously much more of a commitment. So you need to be sure before you do that.
And how long did you stay racing go-karts for?
How old am I now? 35. So probably 25 years. Right up until now, I still kart whenever I can. In fact, obviously with this whole virus period, this has been by far the longest it's been since I've been in a go-kart.
Yeah.
I've always been back out in something, regardless of any car racing I've been doing. Karting is always there in the background. So I never stopped. Although what your question probably was aiming for is when did I move into cars and away from karts, which would have been around about 2007. So that's when my focus turned to cars, and that was with the Toyota MR2 Championship. But I've never stopped wanting to drive go-karts. I've never lost that kind of enjoyment of just getting in a car and driving it as fast as possible.
Absolutely, and they're brilliant fun and the purest form of racing.
Yeah, and and you can get really close to other people and not do too much damage, or certainly never do any expensive damage in a rental car, and it's relatively safe, and and it's just so accessible for people, especially in this country. We're very lucky that unless you're in particularly remote areas, there's generally a kart track within a short drive, within half an hour, wherever you are. So we're quite fortunate there.
Absolutely. So when did the deal come about? When did the offer come about to start racing cars, like you mentioned just a minute ago?
There wasn't really any kind of offer or deal. What happened was I was just working to pay off a loan I'd taken out to buy a kart and race a kart when I was 18. And at the place I was working during my lunch breaks, I would read Autosport, because back then, although there would have been a website, it would have been a very primitive website. And there was an advert. They used to always have adverts for driving competitions, and there was one for a Formula Ford scholarship up at Three Sisters Kart Track up in Wigan, I believe.
Okay.
And it was one of those things where they're still around now. You still see them quite often, where you pay for the first round, and then if you get through to the next rounds, either you pay a bit less or you don't have to pay. And then if you get to the final, you're invited back for free. And then the winner wins this kind of scholarship prize. And so I entered this in the lunch break at my trailer rental job that I was doing, this kind of office job. And then I ended up traveling up to Wigan a few times and getting through to the final of this Formula Ford scholarship. So that was where the car racing began, because although that wasn't a race, obviously that was a scholarship. Although I didn't win it, I came fourth. I met some people who then put me in touch with the race school I ended up working at for the following 12 years. And it was through that the MR2s came about, just through instructing people in cars every day, getting confident in being in a race car, and much, much faster race cars than the ones I would go on to race initially. It was a quite simple step to go from that to then into driving the Toyota MR2s, which ultimately are not a very fast race car, a nice club level entry car. And I think I found that purely because it was the cheapest racing I could do. I'm sure I found an advert again in Autosport that was, drive available. And when I contacted the guys, it was within budget. It wasn't too expensive. I don't think you'd do a single race, let alone a season, for the price that we paid for that whole year.
Really?
Not nowadays, anyway.
And obviously, like you mentioned there, money and budget is such a key part of racing, and it's such an important thing. What advice would you give to anyone who maybe, the budget's not quite big, or getting sponsors? Because obviously that's very important as well.
Yeah, so everyone's in different positions, obviously financially, and as everybody who follows motorsport knows, generally budget is one of the number one constraints to like the ceiling of your driving career, like how far you can go. But there are definitely other things you can do to help yourself out. So basically just doing the absolute maximum with whatever you do have at your disposal tends to then open doors. It's not going to suddenly normally drop a load of money into your bank account, but it may lead to you meeting people who like what you're doing and then believe in you, and then they're willing to help fund the next step. And I know from personal experience that it really is about meeting the right people at the right time who appreciate the effort you're putting in. So I'll just give an example there. There's a kart driver who's quite obvious on BTCC Twitter, and his name's Ty Cuthbert, and he's always very, very promoting himself all the time. He's very active in his self-promotion, and it doesn't miss an opportunity to positively show how good he is and how active he would be at promoting your company if you were to back him. And I haven't gone looking for, I'm not someone who would be sponsoring someone, but I have seen this young lad on my Twitter feed so many times that if I was in that position, I probably wouldn't think twice about promoting him, because I've seen how much work he does for or him and his team do for the sponsors and the partners. So that doesn't cost anything. That's not cost him any money to just speak positively on social media and be very, outgoing about the activities he's doing. And I'm certain that young lad will go places and will end up racing cars, even if he personally didn't have a massive budget. And that's the kind of thing I think people should do. So that's why I don't think you should feel too defeated just by not having the money in the account. And from my own position as well, the company that's going to be sponsoring me this year, once we eventually hopefully are able to get going in racing, it was a chance meeting, and they liked they liked my attitude when I came to speak to them, and we really ended up getting on well. And suddenly we have a race season ahead of us in some really lovely fancy cars. So yeah, the budget is important, but there are ways you can help yourself open doors to that budget. It doesn't have to be money that you personally have.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned with social media and using that. How important as a driver is it to use that to, promote different partners or promote yourself? As it's almost a business, really, being a driver.
Yeah, it really is. And I think it's very important. I think any company who wants to get a genuine benefit from their association with you needs to see, in the modern world, you can't get away with just resting on your laurels and hoping your results do the talking. You do need to be actively promoting yourself and the companies that are backing you. And you do need to be on all these different platforms. I mean, I've just signed up for a TikTok account this week because I don't think I can hold off any longer. I'm on every other platform pretty much, but I think you need to be up to date, and you need to be ready to do the most for people who are backing you, because at the end of the day, they're spending their money, putting their faith in you, and they need to see some return. So yeah, you do have to run yourself as like a brand on social media, and that also involves and I certainly haven't been an angel at this. It involves not tripping up and posting things which could be construed as negative or controversial. So that's something that you also learn, and hopefully as you mature as a driver.
So obviously, yeah, that's definitely good advice to anyone, any drivers coming up. What advice would you give to any young drivers wanting to get into racing?
Work as hard as you can to be as fast as you can is my main advice, because that makes everything else much easier. If you're able to go and be competitive in what you're racing in, if you're able to run at the front, that makes all the rest of your job as a driver much easier, because people trust you, your team trusts you, your sponsors are happier, it's easier to find new sponsors, and you'll have more fun, obviously, because everybody wants to be at the front. So put in the effort to make sure you are as fast as possible, whether that's physical training, learning everything you can about the track before you go there, investigating who your competitors are, watching videos of old races and whatever the series is, just putting in the practice. If you've got a simulator, or even a console where you can drive on the track that you might be racing at, do it, and make sure there's no more time left to find, so that your job at the track is as simple as possible when you get there, because your practice time once you get to the circuit is generally quite short.
Absolutely, and it's funny you mentioned sim racing, because I've seen you do lots of it. Obviously, it's the next best thing, and I guess you'd recommend to drivers obviously doing as much as possible, as it is great practice. And
Yeah, so I think regardless of what level of sim racing we're talking about, whether we're talking about investing loads of money in an expensive rig and computer and wheelbase and pedals, all that kind of thing, or whether we're talking about doing it on a controller or on a low end wheel on a PlayStation 4 or whatever, wherever we're pitching this, it helps you with concentration. It helps you with your confidence, because before you turn up at a race, you've done everything in your power, so you can kind of relax a little bit more. You're not worrying that I could have done a bit more. I wish I'd practiced a bit more. It helps you with racecraft. It helps you with pressure. If you invest emotionally in whatever event it is you're doing, and the kind of races I've been doing recently, I really do care about. I did a race yesterday at the Nürburgring, which is run by the same officials that run the real life Nürburgring racing I do. The driver briefing was by the same guy that does the real driver briefing and everything. And people really care about it. People who are in it, really care about it. So the pressure to not mess up and to be fast and to do a good job for the team that have asked you to drive for them, it's pretty similar to real life. The only things that aren't there, which is quite a nice thing, is physical danger and financial penalties for having an accident. But all the emotional side of it, all the stress side of it is very similar. So if you can do as much of that as possible, again, you're trained that bit better for when you come to do it in the real world. So yeah, I would certainly advocate for anyone who's at home, certainly right now, whilst we can't really go out and do any real racing, just do as much practice as you can on a simulator, so that you're more ready than the other people when we do eventually get back to racing. And when it's not a pandemic, a similar thing applies. If you've got time to spend on your simulator, practicing, racing, doing big competitions or small ones, do it as much as you can, because you'll just be more ready than the other people.
absolutely, it's all about preparation and practice. It was also quite cool to see in the first lockdown, when it seems all the drivers got a sim and got involved on different online championships and stuff.
Yeah, so I watched a lot of these, because obviously there was nothing else to do. So I was sat at home watching, whether it was the IndyCar races they were doing on iRacing, or whether it was the Formula One game stuff that a couple of different channels were broadcasting. And they quite often had webcams showing the drivers and the equipment they were using. And it's amazing seeing the progress from then to now in this latest lockdown, where there's a race, there's a series called the VCO Pro Sim series, where you have to have one professional driver and a professional simulator driver. And one of the rules to prevent people putting a ringer in for them, having two sim drivers and pretending they've got a real world driver, is you have to have a webcam showing you driving all the time. And so all the drivers can see all the other drivers on this big Zoom call. And it's amazing seeing how good everyone's equipment is now. Now we've had 8 or 9 months or whatever of people to improve their home rigs, myself included. The step people have made from the console based or Logitech G27 wheelbases and stuff they had, and now all the drivers are in fancy seats, very expensive direct drive wheelbases, and they all look like they've got real high end expensive kit. So yeah, a lot of the drivers have taken this very, very seriously now.
Absolutely, and it's brilliant fun, which is good as well.
It is that too.
So obviously, I've got to touch on this in this interview. Obviously, you made your British touring car debut at the end of last season with Powermax Racing. How did that come about?
That came about just through a chance meeting of my manager at the time. Knew some of the guys there, was working with a different driver in a different series that they also run cars in, and this opportunity came about because they had the seat available, basically, and I was a driver who was available, who went out and found the necessary budget to do it. It's not often you get an opportunity to race BTCC, and what I mean by that is at a price which is realistic. So, you know, I could go race BTCC probably most years if I had a huge budget, but my kind of personal desires in one aspect, and also the budget that I'm generally capable of raising, don't stretch that. So when I say my personal desires, BTCC's not ever really been a thing I've pushed towards. I've always been much more endurance / sports car focused and interested. And that's probably partly because I never thought the budget would be achievable. So there was no point wasting time worrying about BTCC, because I wouldn't ever be able to quite find that kind of money. So that's the thing that would have always kept me away from it. But suddenly this much cheaper drive arose. And although it's still a lot of money to try and find in a short period, I think I had maybe a month and a half to find the full budget for this race. It was at least kind of doable, and so I gave it a try. It was never guaranteed until I'd managed to find it all. But thanks to a few companies and my main sponsor going forward, which is a company called M4M Animal Shelters, they were the big sponsor on the front and the side of the car. Thanks to them, in a large part, I was able to raise that budget, and so the drive was available to me. So it was one of those things I didn't want to pass up. I always knew it would be very tough to be competitive, especially I've had this in the past where you join the final race of the season where everyone else is not only may have had other seasons, but they've also done every race in this particular season. And, you know, they're very up to speed and just on absolutely sharp in those cars. I knew that'd be tough. And Brands Hatch again, not a track I've really ever raced at before.
Really?
And then it turned out to be the worst weather I've ever seen on a racetrack. So it was a difficult event, but it's one of those things where if I hadn't tried to find the money and I hadn't gone to do the race, I would have regretted not trying. You know, I would have regretted not taking that opportunity. And the nice thing is, going forward, I can always say that I was a BTCC driver. It's nice to have it on your CV. And I'm kind of back to being focused on my previous path, which was endurance racing, predominantly at the Nürburgring.
Absolutely. Well, it was really cool to see you in British touring cars. So I presume you didn't have much testing in the car beforehand, or any.
I had a day at Donington, and it wasn't a normal test session. It was a bit more of a track day where there were lots of other cars on track. So I think in the whole day I maybe got 3 laps that I wasn't held up by another much slower car. When you turn up to most test days, certainly closed car test days in something like a BTCC car, you're very often going to be the fastest car on track. So you're going to be being held up by even other cars which are very fast. A BTCC car is generally a bit quicker. And so it's difficult to get any meaningful running. And coupled to that, it was also wet that kind of gradually got drier. So you never really knew what the conditions were. You're running on old tyres. We were using tyre warmers because it was freezing cold, and you didn't have much time to get the tyres up to temperature. So you don't get to do that in the racing either. So yeah, it was good to be familiarised with what the controls do and get a rough idea of how the car feels. But really, in terms of getting you fully up to speed, it wasn't ideal, and you'd want a bit more of a private test day, certainly with fewer cars and a bit more running in slightly better conditions. So yeah, the testing was definitely limited. And then when you turn up to the race day itself, and it's a totally different track to the one you tested on anyway, and you're on different tyres, the conditions are completely different, and you've got lots of other surrounding pressures, like you're getting ready for the race, different setup, etc. So yeah, the testing was mainly useful for learning what the controls did, making sure I wasn't pressing the wrong buttons or anything silly like that, and making sure you're comfortable in the car.
Absolutely. And what was the Vauxhall Astra British touring car like to drive?
I can be completely honest here because it's, I'm not hopefully going to offend anyone saying this, because anyone who's driven a modern day BTCC car tends to say a similar thing. They're really horrible to drive. You watch on the TV and you think that you have a kind of expectation level of a sort of a neutral balance where maybe if you try a bit too hard, you have a big lift off in the middle of a corner, you'll get some oversteer. But generally they look okay. And my overriding takeaway was how difficult they were to drive, how the thing just does not want to help you out in any way. And what I mean by that is anytime you breathe on the throttle pedal, you'd spin the wheels. This is particularly bad, obviously, because it was wet and, it was wet sessions. So there's not a lot of grip anyway. But even in the dry, when the tyres are not completely up to temperature, which does take a few laps, you touch the throttle pedal and the front wheels just spin. And obviously the moment they spin, you're losing time, you're understeering wide, and it's just all bad. And then you could damage the tyre more or overheat them or whatever. So that's the first thing. The next thing is it takes ages to get any temperature in the rear tyres. So you turn into the corner, and the moment you turn in, the rear wants to move around on you. So you're then having to deal with that as well. So you've got problems at the front end, problems at the rear end all the time. And it's very, very difficult to relax at any point, particularly when it's pouring with rain. But even in the dry, as I say, which I didn't get a lot of dry running, I did have slicks on for the second race, but it was slicks on a mainly damp track with eventually a dry line. So it's not a great gauge of what it's like. But I drove on the slicks in the test. But yeah, the rear wants to move around all the time. You've never got this nice balance of tire temperature between the front and the rear axles, and the car. It's very, very soft. And when I say it, I don't just mean the Astra. I'm sure this is very similar in most of them, because they'll all have these similar characteristics. But yeah, it feels extremely soft in a way that you don't expect a race car to feel. You go through most of your race career, and even in road car-based race cars, they feel stiff and they feel like they're bouncing you around. Every bump you feel, like you're being, like your teeth are going to get rattled out. But the touring car felt like how I would expect a rally car to feel in terms of the squish of the suspension all the time. And it's how it's built to work, but it's very odd. So yeah, my short answer is, what are they like to drive? Not very nice. And so you can see why more seat time definitely benefits people who are used to that style of car. Definitely have an advantage over people who jump in quite last minute.
Absolutely. And did you enjoy it? Did it live up to your expectations, and was it how you imagined it?
As with a lot of these big high profile, high pressure events, it's difficult to have time to enjoy it at the time, because what you're focused on, you're not focused on having fun, because you're not there to kind of, you aren't there as a fun event. You're there to do a job. And the enjoyment, certainly for me, comes from being satisfied that you've done the best job possible afterwards, like looking back on it and thinking, yeah, I don't think I could have got any more out of that in that situation. And if you have a good event, the satisfaction comes from being happy that you won or whatever, going home with the trophy. In the moment, all through that weekend, I don't think I had a single moment's enjoyment, if I'm completely honest. But that's not saying anything bad about the series or the team or the car or whatever. It's purely because you are just focused on doing the best job possible. You don't want to spend a moment where you're not thinking about the data, where I could find some time, what I could be doing differently to get more out of the car, making sure you're fully up to speed with what the current conditions are outside. Is there a river running across the track at Graham Hill or whatever? All those surrounding things, updating your social media, talking with the team, talking with sponsors, like looking after people who have backed you to be there. There's very, very little time to actually enjoy it. So it's probably an unexpected answer, but I wouldn't say I did enjoy it too much. But I think that's because I don't tend to enjoy most racing I do until afterwards. It's the build up, it's the putting the work in and reflecting on a job well done that I find the satisfaction from.
Absolutely. Well, you've been absolutely brilliant, giving a great insight. Just to finish off, If there was, say, a right deal on the table, would you come back to British touring cars at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I would never close the door to that. It's as I said earlier, it's difficult to find a budget which you think will do you justice. I'm sure if I worked very very hard, I could scrabble together some money to do a one-off race again. But I'm not really interested in that. I've had a taster. I understand a bit more about what the cars and the series are like from the inside. I met some really cool people. Certainly met a very very cool sponsor, and I I would love to come back and do it properly. I'd love to come back knowing you've got a full season, all the time to do the preparation, and being able to build on one race to the next. Because, as it's probably obvious, I went away from the Brands Hatch weekend thinking, well, if I'd known what I know now at the beginning of the weekend, I would make a lot of different decisions.
Of
Just one,
course.
for example, I would have stayed on wet tires for race two
Yeah.
because I saw very plainly how much advantage or how much disadvantage you have on cold slicks on a slightly damp track, and we kind of gambled to get a benefit towards the end of the race, which we got, but it wasn't enough. So I now have a bit more of an understanding of just how big an advantage wet tires on a not completely dry and slightly cold track are, and I would bank on that and gain a load of places at the start and then just try and defend from there like some of the other guys did. So anyway, loads of lessons like that I would take with me. And I'd love the opportunity to then build on each race. Okay, we're going to another track and I can use the lessons I learned at the previous track for the next track. But what I wouldn't be interested in is coming back for a single round. Just to, it's different when you've never done it before. And now you can say, okay, you've raced British touring cars. But when you have already done that, I don't think there's much point coming back for a single one-off round because it's, as I said, you struggle to do yourself justice. I would want from this point onwards to be demonstrating some real performance and some pace. So that's why I'm really happy about what I am actually doing this coming season, which will be multiple rounds in the same car in the same championship. So looking forward to that.
Absolutely, very very understandable. Well, thank you so very much for coming on and getting involved, and you've given a brilliant insight, like I say, to sim racing and obviously what goes on behind the scenes, obviously in touring cars and all sorts of other brilliant stuff. So thank you.
Thanks for having me, Louis. Have a nice
No
day.
worries.